At a launch event with 2,000 people watching, my husband announced that we were separated. I was sitting in the front row. He said it so naturally that for a second, I wondered if I had somehow missed a conversation about my own marriage. Claire and I have decided to end our marriage. This is a mutual decision we reached after a lot of discussion. The room went silent. Then dozens of cameras turned toward me. My name is Claire Bennett. I was 31 years old, sitting in the front row of SkyArc Aviation's new fleet launch in Chicago, and the man standing on stage was my husband of 4 years, Grant Holloway. There was just one problem. We had slept in the same bed the night before. At 7 that morning, before leaving the house, Grant had kissed me on the forehead. He told me, once tonight is over, things will finally get easier. I thought he meant work. Now I realized he meant me. Grant paused on stage and held out his hand. Tessa Vaughn walked out from the side. She was SkyArc's head of brand strategy. And for the past 6 months, she had been beside my husband at every business dinner, every industry interview, and almost every magazine photo shoot. She wore a silver evening dress. Grant casually placed his hand around her waist. Going forward, Tessa will join me as co-CEO and help lead SkyArc into its next chapter. The room broke into applause. I didn't move. My mother-in-law, Diane Holloway, was sitting beside me. She quietly pushed a white envelope onto my lap. "Don't make a scene." I looked down. Divorce papers. The pages were already marked where I was supposed to sign. Diane leaned closer. "Grant needs a woman who can actually stand beside him in public. You should have figured that out by now." For a second, all I could hear was a low ringing in my ears. It wasn't because I had just lost my husband. It was because I suddenly understood that everyone else already knew. The lawyers knew, the PR team knew, the board knew, the reporters probably knew, even my mother-in-law knew. The only person who didn't know I was getting divorced was me. Behind the stage, a giant screen began playing a promotional video for SkyArc's new fleet. 6 brand-new long-range private jets slowly rolled out of a hangar. Together, they were worth about $260 million. They were also the biggest achievement of Grant's career. The host stepped forward. "In 15 minutes, SkyArc 1 will complete its first official demonstration flight." Everyone applauded again. Diane looked at me. "You should leave now. If reporters photograph you crying, it will make things worse for everyone." I put the divorce papers back into the envelope. Then I took out my phone. I didn't call Grant. I didn't call a lawyer. I sent one message. "Suspend Covenant 7. Ground all 6 aircraft immediately." Less than a minute later, the first jet stopped moving. Then the second, then the third. The door of one aircraft opened again and the captain climbed out of the cockpit. Grant turned around. Staff members started checking their phones. The countdown on the giant screen suddenly disappeared. The host froze. Then one of SkyArc's operations managers rushed onto the stage and whispered something into Grant's ear. Grant's face changed. "What do you mean? Why are the planes grounded?" The manager shook his head. "Blue Harbor Aerolease just revoked temporary flight authorization. They've ordered all 6 aircraft to remain on the ground." Grant raised his voice. "We signed a 15-year agreement. They can't just cancel authorization tonight." The manager said something else. Grant stopped talking, because Blue Harbor wasn't some minor leasing company. Blue Harbor owned all 6 aircraft in SkyArc's new fleet. SkyArc had never bought them. Grant couldn't afford to buy them. He had leased them. And the final controlling beneficiary of Blue Harbor Aerolease was me. I stood up. Diane grabbed my wrist. "Where are you going? Home?" I looked at her. "No, I'm going to take back my planes." Grant found me backstage after the launch fell apart. Reporters were crowded around the exits. Investors were demanding to know why a $260 million fleet had been grounded minutes before its public debut. Tessa was across the hallway making frantic calls. Grant pushed open the door to the private lounge. "What did you do?" I was taking off my heels. My feet had been killing me all night. I pulled a pair of flats out of my bag. "I stopped something that belongs to me. Claire, I don't have time for games. Why is Blue Harbor taking orders from you?" I looked at him. 4 years of marriage, and he had never once asked who actually controlled Blue Harbor. All he knew was that 3 years earlier, when SkyArc was nearly out of options, a private aircraft leasing company suddenly offered him incredibly favorable financing terms. He believed his business plan had impressed them. It hadn't. I had asked them to approve the deal. Blue Harbor belongs to the Bennett Family Trust. Grant didn't react at first, then the anger slowly disappeared from his face. Bennett? I nodded. My mother's family trust. I hold the controlling vote. The room went completely quiet. Grant stared at me. You never told me. You never asked. You said your family invested in aviation. They do. You didn't say they owned Blue Harbor. You didn't tell me we had mutually agreed to get divorced. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Tessa walked in. She no longer looked like the woman smiling under the stage lights. Grant, the media needs an explanation. Then she looked at me. Claire, you can't let a personal situation damage a company with 800 employees. A personal situation. You prepared divorce papers without telling me. Then you announced my separation in front of 2,000 people, and now you're telling me this is personal? Tessa stayed calm. The marriage hasn't been working for a long time. Grant needs someone beside him who actually understands the company. I almost laughed. Someone who understood the company. She probably didn't know who built SkyArc's first safety management system. She didn't know who reviewed the original fleet maintenance model, and she definitely didn't know who personally guaranteed $90 million in financing when every bank refused to lend SkyArc money 3 years earlier. I had never felt the need to mention any of that. I thought married people didn't keep score. What I didn't understand was that if someone benefits from your work long enough without knowing where it came from, they can eventually convince themselves your contribution never existed. Grant lowered his voice. Claire, let's go home and talk. Just restore the flight authorization first. By tomorrow morning, the media will be saying SkyArc has a liquidity problem. I asked him, what about the divorce? He paused. That was a PR decision. A PR decision? Tessa is moving onto the board. Some investors thought our marriage created the wrong image. I stared at him. So you announced our divorce to protect the company? We haven't acted like a normal married couple in years. You spend most of your time at home. You hate public events. What does this actually change for you? That sentence made me completely still. 4 years of marriage, and in his mind, as long as my daily routine stayed the same, he could announce our divorce without asking me. Because according to him, I wasn't really losing anything. I took out the papers Diane had given me. I placed them on the table. Fine. Grant visibly relaxed. He thought I was going to sign. Instead, I pushed them toward him. Have your attorney contact mine tomorrow. If you already announced the divorce for me, we might as well make it real. I met Grant years earlier, long before SkyArc existed. Back then, he was an operations manager for a small charter company in Chicago. We met at the Denver airport during a snowstorm. More than 30 flights had been delayed. I was sitting on the floor near the gate, reviewing aircraft maintenance data on my laptop. Grant crouched beside me and placed a cup of hot chocolate on the floor. You've been staring at that screen for 3 hours? I looked up. Were you watching me? No. I was watching the gate. You just happened to be sitting in front of it. I laughed later. We ended up on the same flight. We talked for 2 hours. He knew I was an aviation systems engineer. He did not know anything about my family. I didn't lie to him. I simply didn't volunteer the information. Growing up, there was one thing I hated. People would hear my last name and suddenly become much friendlier. My grandfather had founded one of the largest private aircraft leasing businesses in the country. My mother, Elaine, later divided the company into several private trusts. Before I turned 28, almost everyone I met knew me as the Bennett girl. I was tired of it. I wanted to know if there was someone who could simply like Claire. No money, no board seats, no family office. Grant seemed like that person, at least in the beginning. When we dated, he picked me up in an SUV with more than 120,000 miles on it. We ate burgers at little restaurants near airports. He listened when I talked about aircraft systems, and I helped him write the first business plan for SkyArc. After we got married, he left his job and started the company. I chose not to join management. That was my decision. I told him, SkyArc should be yours. I don't want people saying you built it with my family's name. So I helped quietly. I reviewed safety procedures, introduced suppliers, edited financing documents, and when the company almost failed, I guaranteed its debt. Everything went through private trusts. Grant knew investors believed in him. He just didn't know one of those investors was me. At the time, I thought it was romantic. Now I know that hiding yourself isn't romantic. Sometimes it simply teaches someone to live without seeing you. The next morning, I moved out of our house in Lake Forest, not because the house belonged to Grant. It didn't. I had bought it before we were married. But I couldn't stay there. Every room made the last 4 years feel like a story I no longer recognized. Grant called 23 times. I didn't answer. At noon, I went to a law office downtown. Lucas Reed was waiting for me in a conference room. I hadn't seen him in 9 years. We had known each other at MIT. He studied aviation safety and law. I studied systems engineering. Lucas later worked in transportation safety before becoming an aviation compliance attorney. He still looked almost exactly the same. Dark shirt, quiet expression. No wasted movement. The first thing he asked me was, "Have you eaten?" I blinked. No. He pushed a wrapped sandwich across the table. "Eat first. Your divorce can survive a 10-minute lunch break." I laughed. It was the first real laugh I'd had in 24 hours. Lucas read through the divorce papers. Then he asked one question. "Are you sure you want the divorce?" "Yes." "You're not trying to scare him?" "No." "You're not hoping this forces him to apologize and come back?" "No." He nodded. "Then we handle it as a real divorce." He didn't tell me to calm down. He didn't tell me 4 years of marriage deserved another chance. He only made sure the decision was mine. For some reason, that almost made me cry. But I held it together. Lucas turned several more pages, then his expression changed. "What is this?" I leaned over. There was an attachment I had never seen. It said that if SkyArc suffered major commercial losses because of personal actions taken by Claire Bennett, marital assets could be used to compensate the company. At the bottom was my electronic signature. I stared at it. "I didn't sign this." Lucas looked up. "You're sure?" 100%. "Did you ever authorize Grant to use your engineering digital certificate? For aircraft safety documentation only?" Lucas didn't answer immediately. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. "Why are you asking?" He turned his laptop toward me. "Because this isn't a normal electronic signature. It was signed with your licensed engineering credentials." I put down my sandwich. "That credential is stored only on SkyArc's internal secure server." Lucas looked at me. "Then we may be dealing with a lot more than divorce." It took us 2 days to get the SkyArc server access logs. Grant's attorneys delayed as much as they could. Eventually, Lucas filed an emergency preservation request with the court. Once we got the data, I barely slept. My engineering certificate had been used 47 times over the past 11 months. I had personally signed only 19 of those documents. I had never seen the other 28. 6 of them involved final maintenance approvals for the new fleet. I opened them one by one. The more I read, the colder I felt. Before an aircraft enters service, critical parts have to be fully traceable. You should know who manufactured them when they were installed, who inspected them, and whether they were approved for that aircraft. Several serial numbers did not match. Some supplier names were completely unfamiliar to me. I called an engineer who used to work in SkyArc's safety department. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Claire, you should stop asking questions." "Why?" "Because the last person who asked was fired." "Who?" "Martin Shaw." I knew Martin. He was in his 50s and had spent more than 20 years in aircraft maintenance. Every time I saw him, he carried those peppermint candies that were way too sweet. 6 months earlier, he had suddenly left SkyArc. Grant told me Martin had retired. He hadn't. I found Martin working at a small maintenance shop in Wisconsin. The second he saw me, he said, "Did Grant send you?" "No." "Then you should leave." I placed the documents with my forged signature on his desk. His face changed. He finally let me into his office. Martin told me that the new fleet had gone massively over budget. That was when Grant's father, Warren Holloway, started getting involved in purchasing. Warren thought aviation companies wasted too much money on what he called excessive safety. He found cheaper suppliers. Some of their parts had incomplete certification. Martin refused to install them. 2 weeks later, he was suspended. Then someone used my engineering credentials to approve the parts. I asked him, "Did Grant know?" Martin didn't answer for several seconds. Finally, he said he was in the meeting. My chest tightened.
He approved it. He didn't exactly say yes. He said, "If Claire signs off, I'm fine with it." The next morning, your signature appeared. I felt sick. Grant knew I would never approve those parts. So what he needed was not my professional judgment. He needed my name. That was already bad enough. Then, before I left, Martin stopped me. Claire. I turned around.
He pulled an old newspaper clipping from a drawer. 12 years earlier, a small business aircraft had crashed in northern Michigan. 2 people died. One of them was my older brother, Jamie. I stared at the photograph. "Why are you showing me this?" Martin spoke slowly. "Because I've seen Warren do this before." My hands began to shake. Jamie was 6 years older than me. He was the first person in our family who truly loved flying. He was one of the reasons I became an aviation engineer. 12 years earlier, he joined a short test flight. Less than 20 minutes after takeoff, the aircraft lost power. The official investigation blamed a mechanical failure combined with pilot error. My father never boarded another private plane after that. 2 years later, he died from cancer. For more than a decade, I believed Jamie's crash was simply the worst piece of luck our family had ever experienced. Then Martin told me that one of the maintenance contractors connected to that aircraft had once belonged to Warren Holloway. My mind went blank. "Are you sure?" I was young. I worked there for about a year. After the crash, Warren told everyone never to talk about that aircraft. The company changed names later. Then it was sold, I asked. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Martin looked down. "Because I was scared. I had 2 kids. I needed a job. For 12 years I told myself I didn't really know anything." He looked back at me. "But now your husband is doing the same thing." I can't stay quiet again. I barely spoke during the drive back to Chicago. Lucas was driving. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't tell me to be strong. As we got closer to the city, he finally said, "You don't have to decide today whether you want to reopen Jamie's case." I looked out the window. "If I don't, I'm going to think about it every day for the rest of my life." "Then we investigate. What if it was just a coincidence?" "Then you'll finally know. And if it wasn't?" Lucas kept his eyes on the road. "Then we make the people responsible answer for it, not revenge, not destroy them. Just make them answer for what they did." I didn't realize how badly I needed to hear that. Grant came to the apartment where I was staying on the 3rd night. I didn't want to see him. He said he only needed 10 minutes. I asked Lucas to stay downstairs, not because I thought Grant would hurt me. I just didn't want to face everything alone anymore. Grant looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Tessa has withdrawn from the co-CEO arrangement." I said nothing. "What happened at the launch was wrong. Keep going." "I should have told you before the announcement." I almost laughed. "You think the problem is that you didn't warn me first?" Grant closed his eyes. "Claire, I know you're angry. But SkyArc may not survive this. The 6 new jets are grounded. The banks are reviewing our credit. Investors are asking whether Blue Harbor is going to pull the rest of the fleet." I asked, "Did you come here for your wife or your airplanes?" He froze. "That isn't fair. Actually, I think it is." I put the forged documents on the table. The moment Grant saw them, his expression changed. "Where did you get these?" That reaction told me everything, "So you knew." "Claire, who copied my signature?" "I didn't personally do it." "Who did?" "The IT compliance team." "Who told them to?" He didn't answer. "I already knew." "Warren?" Grant sat down. "The new fleet was way over budget. If we missed delivery, the financing would collapse. My father found alternative suppliers. The parts weren't certified. They weren't uncertified. Their certifications just weren't complete. There is no such thing as almost safe on an airplane." Grant raised his voice. "We didn't crash a plane. For the first time, I raised mine too. So as long as nobody dies, it's okay to forge my name?" The room went silent. Grant looked down after a long time. He said, "I thought we could fix the paperwork later." And suddenly I wasn't angry anymore. Because I finally understood his pattern. Grant didn't wake up one morning and become a different man. He just kept choosing whatever was easiest in the moment. Use my financial backing first. Explain later. Use my engineering credentials first. Explain later. Announce our divorce first. Explain later. Every important decision in his life could bypass me as long as he eventually said the same thing. "I thought you'd understand." Then I asked him, "Has your father ever mentioned Jamie Bennett?" Grant looked up. The fear in his eyes was immediate. My stomach dropped. "You know, Claire, that crash happened before we even met, so you do know." I only heard my father mention it once. "When? Last year?" I felt like the room had shifted under me. "Last year?" He said your brother had once flown on an aircraft his company maintained. That's all? Grant looked away. There was more. I knew it. I stood. Get out. Claire. Get out. You can't take something that happened 12 years ago and connect it to SkyArc. I walked to the door. I'm not connecting anything. Your family already did that. Before he left, Grant turned back. You're going to destroy everything. I looked at him. No. For the first time, I'm just not hiding it for you. Over the next 2 weeks, things moved faster than I expected. Lucas tracked down the independent inspector who had worked on Jamie's crash. He was retired and living in Arizona. The first time Lucas called, he refused to talk. The second time, he hung up. The third time, Lucas sent him one sentence. Claire Bennett only wants to know why her brother never came home. The man called us the next day. His name was Robert Hale. He admitted that investigators had found a fuel control component on Jamie's aircraft that should not have been there. Its serial number traced back to a supplier that no longer existed. Robert wanted to investigate further. Before he could submit his final report, his supervisor ordered him to remove that section. The explanation was simple. There was no way to prove the part had directly caused the crash. Robert kept a private copy. For 12 years, nobody asked for it. We flew to Phoenix and picked it up. The supplier was called Orion Dynamics. Lucas spent 2 days tracing the ownership. Eventually, it led back to Warren Holloway. I sat on the floor of my hotel room staring at a chart of shell companies 12 years ago. My brother, now, my signature. The same pattern, cheaper parts, hidden suppliers, altered paperwork. This wasn't one bad business decision. It was a family that had spent decades believing rules were for people without money. We didn't go public immediately. Lucas advised me to turn everything over to federal aviation regulators and prosecutors first. I agreed. But Warren clearly realized someone was investigating. The next day, an article appeared online. The headline read, "Jilted Harris uses family fortune to destroy husband's airline." The article said I had hidden my wealth for years. Then, after my marriage fell apart, I used Blue Harbor to intentionally ground SkyArc's fleet. It said hundreds of employees could lose their jobs because of me. It also hinted that I had unresolved psychological trauma from my brother's death and was turning normal business problems into a conspiracy. Then they released part of a therapy session I had attended 3 years earlier. It was around the anniversary of Jamie's death. In the recording, I said, "Sometimes I still dream about the plane falling. When I wake up, I feel like I should have done something." The internet turned on me almost instantly. People called me unstable. They said rich women were dangerous during divorce. They said Grant had simply fallen in love with someone else and I was destroying his company because I couldn't accept it. People even gathered outside SkyArc headquarters to support him. For the first time, I seriously doubted myself, not because strangers hated me, but because SkyArc really did have more than 800 employees. Most of them knew nothing. Mechanics, customer service agents, Spidias, pilots. If SkyArc collapsed, they would pay a price too. That night, I asked Lucas, what happens if I keep going and SkyArc fails? It might. What about the employees? That's the hardest part. He didn't lie and tell me everything would be fine, I asked. What if I let the planes fly again? I wouldn't recommend it. Why? Because now you know the maintenance records may be compromised. If those aircraft go back into service, you're gambling with passengers who know nothing about any of this. I closed my eyes. He was right. This was no longer about whether I could forgive Grant. The price of keeping everyone comfortable would be putting complete strangers at risk. I couldn't do that. During the 3rd week, Tessa contacted me. She wanted to meet at a hotel bar. She looked exhausted. No heavy makeup, no assistant. She placed her phone on the table. "I have something you want." "What?" "Recordings of Grant and Warren." I didn't reach for the phone. "How much?" She looked surprised. Then she smiled. 3 million. I laughed too. She frowned. "You think that's too much?" "No. I just finally understand that you never loved him." Tessa's face hardened. "Don't act superior. He lied to me first. He told me you two were already planning a divorce. He said that once SkyArc became successful, all you wanted was a payout." I believed him. "And then?" She didn't answer. "So when you realized he might go to prison, you decided to sell the recordings?" Tessa leaned back. "Everybody has to protect themselves." It sounded exactly like Grant. I suddenly understood why they had worked so well together. "I'm not paying you." She stared at me. You'll regret that, maybe. But if those recordings can save you, you'll release them eventually, I stood. Because you're more afraid of being attached to a failed man than you ever were of hurting me. I walked away. When Lucas heard what happened, he asked, "What if she deletes the recordings?" "She won't." "How do you know?" "Because she needs people to know she has them." 2 days later, Tessa posted an audio clip online. She originally meant to present herself as another woman Grant had lied to. Instead, the recording gave us exactly what we needed. Warren's voice was clear. Certification is paperwork. If the plane can fly, that's what matters. Grant asked. "What if Claire finds out?" Warren answered. "She loves you. Get her to sign it. A woman who still wants to save her marriage will eventually give in." I listened to that line without crying. I just felt very still. They had known exactly what they were doing. My love, my patience, my dislike of conflict, none of those things had ever made them value me more. They had treated them as weaknesses they could use. The federal investigation became official almost immediately. All 6 new SkyArc aircraft were detained for inspection. 2 were found to contain unapproved critical components. 3 others had serious problems in their maintenance records. Grant was suspended by the board. Warren's private companies were audited, but the real turning point came from the 12-year-old report Robert Hale had saved. Investigators reopened Jamie's crash. They found backup maintenance records. Then they located a retired mechanic named Samuel Ortiz. He lived in New Mexico. Samuel admitted that 4 days before Jamie's crash, he had been ordered to replace a faulty fuel control unit. The approved replacement part was unavailable. His supervisor told him to install a cheaper component from Orion Dynamics. Samuel refused to sign the work order. The next morning, someone else's signature appeared on the maintenance record. After the crash, Warren's company paid Samuel a large severance package. They also made him sign a confidentiality agreement. Samuel spent years telling himself that staying quiet had simply been the price of keeping his job. Then he heard about SkyArc. The same kind of parts. The same kind of missing approvals. He agreed to testify. I sat outside the interview room for 10 minutes without speaking. Finally, I asked Lucas, if Jamie had known that part was unsafe, do you think he still would have gotten on that plane? Lucas didn't try to answer a question no one could answer. He said, "Your brother should never have been forced to take a risk he didn't know existed." That was when I started crying, because that was the point. The question wasn't whether Jamie would have accepted the risk. Someone had taken away his chance to choose, just like Grant had taken mine again and again. After Grant was formally charged, he asked to see me once. We met in a law office. A glass table separated us. Both of our attorneys were there. He looked 10 years older than he had on the night of the launch. I didn't know my father was connected to Jamie's crash. I said nothing. I swear, I only knew his company had been involved in old aviation incidents. My father always called them normal industry risk. And now? Grant looked down. Now I know what kind of man he is. I asked, "What about you?" He looked up. "What do you mean? Don't tell me what kind of man your father is. Tell me what kind of man you became." He was silent for a long time. I wanted to succeed too badly. I kept thinking if I could just get the company through the next financing round, I could fix everything afterward. I wanted to prove I didn't need you. I almost couldn't believe the irony. So you used my money, my planes, my work, and eventually even my signature. Grant's eyes filled with tears. I know. I really did love you. I shook my head. You did? At least in the beginning. But later, you loved the version of Claire who never got in your way. She helped you. She understood you. She let you stand in front. And most importantly, she never asked what you were doing with her name. Grant started crying. It was the first time I had ever seen him like that, but it didn't hurt the way it once would have. I had finally learned something important. Someone regretting the loss of you does not mean they have become someone who deserves you back. I don't want your life destroyed, I told him. But I'm not saving you again. That was the last private conversation we ever had. 6 months later, the cases reached their final stage. Warren was charged with corporate fraud, falsifying maintenance records, obstruction of safety investigations, bribery, and several criminal counts connected to Jamie's crash. Prosecutors could not prove that Warren had intentionally caused Jamie's death, but they proved that he knew unsafe parts were being installed, allowed it to continue, and systematically destroyed evidence afterward. He was sentenced to 27 years. Grant received 8 years for falsifying safety records, misleading investors, and illegally using my engineering credentials. Tessa received a much lighter sentence because she eventually provided key evidence. SkyArc entered bankruptcy restructuring. People asked me, "You must be happy now." I wasn't watching a man you once ate burgers with near an airport get taken away in handcuffs doesn't make you happy. Justice and happiness are not the same thing. Sometimes justice only means no one else has to pay for what those people chose to do. Blue Harbor eventually repossessed the remaining SkyArc aircraft. The board asked whether I wanted to sell all of them. I didn't. 4 of the jets were completely inspected, repaired, and recertified. Then they became part of a new project. I called it Open Route Air. It wasn't a luxury charter company, it provided emergency medical transportation for patients living in remote areas. Jamie used to complain about one thing more than almost anything else. He would say there was something ridiculous about a rich person spending $100,000 to save 2 hours of travel time, while someone else couldn't reach a hospital quickly enough to save their life. So, I took aircraft that had once been used to carry wealthy clients and turned them into medical transport planes. The first official mission carried a 9-year-old girl from North Dakota to Minneapolis for heart surgery. I stood outside the hangar as the plane took off. Lucas was beside me. I watched it leave the runway. Then tears started running down my face. Lucas handed me a tissue. "Happy tears this time? Maybe. You're not sure?" "I've recently discovered that several emotions can exist at the same time," he smiled. "That sounds like progress." My relationship with Lucas developed slowly. So slowly that one day my mother finally asked me, "Are you two dating? Or are you just reading aviation regulations together?" "I don't know." She shook her head. "Smart people can be exhausting." The truth was, I knew Lucas liked me. He simply never forced me to define anything. We worked together. We traveled to New Mexico to meet witnesses. We spent nights organizing evidence. Sometimes at 1 in the morning, he would leave takeout on my desk and go back to reading his own files. He never used my vulnerable moments as an excuse to get closer. He didn't make big romantic speeches when I was hurting. He simply stayed. 4 months after the case ended, I asked him to dinner. When he sat down, he said, "Is this a work dinner? If you keep asking, it's going to become one." He smiled. "Then I'll stop talking." For our first real date, we went to a small restaurant near the airport. It turned out to be the same place where Grant and I had eaten after we first met. Lucas didn't know that. I hadn't planned it either. The moment I realized where we were, I went quiet. Lucas noticed. "Do you want to go somewhere else?" I shook my head. "No. I want to find out if the same place can hold a different memory." Nothing dramatic happened that night. We ate burgers. The waitress brought me the wrong drink. A child at the next table cried almost the entire time, but on the way home I realized I had been smiling for most of the drive. A safe relationship does not always feel like a movie. Sometimes it simply means you don't have to keep guessing. 1 year later, Open Route was operating 9 medical aircraft across the Midwest. I had also returned to engineering. Not just as an investor, not just as a board member. I put my work vest back on and started spending time in the hangars again. One day, a young engineer called me Ms. Bennett, just Claire. She looked surprised. "You really own this company?" "Part of it." "Then why are you still inspecting systems yourself?" "Because I like doing it." The answer was so simple, but it made me think about the previous 4 years. During my marriage, I slowly stopped doing a lot of things I loved. I stopped attending industry conferences. I turned down public positions. I stopped telling people which projects I had helped build. I thought that was what supporting a husband looked like. But supporting someone else should never require you to slowly disappear from your own life. Lucas proposed on the 2nd anniversary of Open Route. There was no press conference, no media, no private jet waiting outside. We were standing in an ordinary hangar. Snow was falling outside. The mechanics had already gone home. Lucas handed me a small box. I didn't open it immediately. "I had a speech prepared," he said, "but I forgot most of it." I laughed. "Good, saves time." He laughed too. Then he became serious. "Claire, I'm not going to tell you that we've been together long enough so you should say yes. I'm not going to tell you what kind of life I can give you. You already have your own life. I just want to ask one thing. Would you let me keep being part of it?" I looked at him. It was my favorite proposal I had ever heard. Not, "I'll take care of you," not, "I'll give you a better life." Not, what would you do without me, just, your life is already complete. Can I be part of it? Yes, I said. Our wedding had 60 guests. My mother sat in the front row. Martin came. Samuel came. A few families open route had helped came too. We didn't rent a luxury hotel. We held the ceremony inside a renovated aircraft hangar. There was a photograph of Jamie near the entrance. Not because I wanted the wedding to feel sad, I just knew that if my brother had been alive, he would have looked at Lucas and said something like, "At least this one isn't going to steal your airplanes." After the ceremony, Lucas and I walked outside. The sky was clear. An open route aircraft was coming in to land. I watched it roll toward the hangar, and suddenly I remembered the launch years earlier. 6 planes coming to a stop, everyone staring at me. Grant believing I had destroyed his future. Back then, I thought winning meant making the people who hurt me lose everything. I don't believe that anymore. Warren going to prison was not the most important thing that happened to me. Grant losing SkyArc wasn't either. The thing that changed my life was finally understanding that I could stop disappearing just to keep someone else's love. For years, I wanted to prove something. If I had no money, no family name, no influence, would a man still love me? Eventually, I realized that was the wrong question. Someone who truly loves you does not need you to become smaller first. You should not have to hide your intelligence, your career, your background, your ambition. You should not have to pretend that things don't matter when they do. Healthy love is not asking, if I had nothing, would you still love me? The better question is, when I stand in front of you as my whole self, will you still respect me? Grant once loved a Claire who was quiet, convenient, and always ready to fix his problems. Lucas loved a Claire who disagreed with him. A Claire who worked until midnight. A Claire who changed her mind. A Claire who knew how to say no. That was the difference. People say love requires sacrifice. I agree. Love requires time, patience, communication when both people are exhausted. Sometimes it means putting your pride aside and apologizing first. But love should never require you to surrender your judgment. And it should never require you to hand your name, your career, or your future over to another person. My husband once stole my signature. His father spent years taking away other people's ability to choose whether a risk was worth taking. In the end, I learned that the most important thing a person owns is not money, it is not a company, it is choice, knowing the truth and still being free to say, yes, no, I want to stay, I want to leave. That is what it means to have a life that truly belongs to you. Someone once asked me if I could go back to the time before that launch, would I tell Grant who I really was from the beginning? I thought about it for a long time. My answer is yes, not because knowing my family background might have stopped him from betraying me, but because I will never again hide pieces of myself just to test someone else's love. If a man can only love me when I pretend to be smaller than I am, then he never loved the whole version of me. On the night Lucas and I left our wedding, light snow started falling. He looked at me. Are you cold? A little. He took off his coat and held it toward me. Then he asked, "Is this okay?" I smiled. Yes. It was such a small thing. He loved me, but he never assumed that gave him ownership over my body, my choices, or my life. Even with something as simple as putting his coat around my shoulders, he asked first, years ago, I probably would have thought that didn't matter. Now I know those small moments are exactly what make a relationship safe. Respect is not one beautiful sentence during a proposal. It is asking every day, what do you think? Do you want this? Do you need me? Or would you rather handle it yourself? I spent 4 years making myself smaller for love. In the end, I lost a marriage, but I found myself again. And if that was the price I had to pay, looking back now, I would still pay it,